Well, welcome everyone. Can you hear me? Thanks. Welcome to our Illuminate Speaker presentation for today. It gives me my name's Mark Garrett. I'm the Department Head for Physical Therapy here at University of Manitoba. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joanne Parsons. Dr. Parsons is an Associate Professor in the Department of Physical Therapy here at University of Manitoba. Her research program explores the use of resistance training to maximize health and performance, as well as decrease sports injury risk across diverse populations. A critical piece of Dr. Parsons' work is considering and exploring how the pervasive gendered environments that surround girls and women may increase their risk of injury and affect participation and performance. Dr. Parsons' clinical training and years spent working on sports sidelines heavily informs her focus on applied practice to ensure her work resonates with knowledge users in order to make real-world impact. Over to you, Dr. Parsons.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today. I'd first like to acknowledge that I live, work, and play, and I'm doing this presentation on traditional Indigenous and Métis lands. I grew up in a small town called Birtle, which is on the west side of Manitoba. And there is a residential school in Birtle it's still there, but it's abandoned. And so I always knew of the existence of residential schools. It was on the top of the hill, kind of towering over the town, so you couldn't miss it. But it wasn't until the last number of years, I would say, that I fully begun to understand the extent of what they were for, their purpose, and the extent of their negative impact on the health and well-being of Indigenous people. And so I'm dedicated to furthering my knowledge and my learning and to collaborating for reconciliation. I have 3 objectives with my talk today. If you're interested in learning something, or you can just sit back and listen, it doesn't matter to me. But if you so choose, by the end of this presentation, you may be able to compare the traditional or historical approach to studying anterior cruciate ligament or ACL injuries with the gendered environmental approach that I'm going to describe. You'll be able to critique whether known risk factors for ACL injury are intrinsic, extrinsic, modifiable, and or non-modifiable. As well as I want to leave you with some concrete actions that you might be able to take in your own involvement in sport, if you are involved, to see if we can positively influence sport environments. So to set the stage, I'm actually going to show you the short video from Sedona Prince. So Sedona is a basketball player in the NCAA, and she plays with a Division I university. She recorded and posted this video about 3 years ago at the National Championship Tournament.
I got something to show y'all. So for the NCAA March Madness, the biggest tournament in college basketball for women, this is our weight room. Let me show y'all the men's weight room. Now, when pictures of our weight room got released versus the men's, the NCAA came out with a statement saying that it wasn't money, it was space that was a problem. Let me show y'all something else. Here's our practice court, right? And then here's that weight room. And then here's all this extra space. If you aren't upset about this problem, then you're a part of it.
So that video, short and quite shocking, right? That this would be happening in 2021 when that video came out. That video came out the very week that our gendered environmental approach was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So we could not have asked for a better or more clear-cut example of the ideas that we were trying to get across in our paper. We had no idea at the time where this paper would take us. It's taken us all over the world. We've just returned from Monaco, where we presented our work at the 7th International Olympic Committee World Conference on Prevention of Injury and Illness in Sport. And that's my colleague and co-author there, Dr. Stephanie Cohen. So yes, I would never have gone to Monaco, and I never would have imagined that I would have been in Monaco with my academic career. So very lucky. So 3 years on since publication, and there's a continued attention of our work because of this constant stream of ACL ruptures in elite women's sport, especially in women's soccer. Our papers receive consistent global attention from media the world over, the sport community as well as the academic community. And it really seems that people have resonated with our ideas. And I think part of it is that we were just able to put into words what a lot of people were thinking for a long time, that maybe much of women's injury risk in sport could maybe be explained by the undervaluing and under-resourcing of women's sport. So I'll just take a step back and describe the problem that we wanted to address with our publication. Girls and women are anywhere from 3 to 6 times more likely to experience ACL injury compared to boys and men. And we've known about this gendered inequity in injury risk since about the 1990s. Since the 1990s, ACL injury rates have either decreased or stayed the same for boys and men, but they have increased or stayed the same for girls and women, depending on the population that you look at. So in 30 years, tens of thousands of academic publications, studies done on ACL injury risk. We really haven't moved the needle a lot on girls and women's injury risk. ACL injuries are pretty significant. They have an immediate impact on health, but also can influence physical and emotional health in the longer term. And especially for girls and women, they have poorer outcomes after surgery compared to boys and men. They have a higher risk of early onset osteoarthritis and then subsequent knee replacement compared to boys and men. And then there's also a slower or else no return at all to pre-injury level of sport, whereas men return faster and return at higher rates to their pre-injury level of sport. The problem as we saw it when we authored our publication was that the approach to ACL injury to that point had focused on anatomy, physiology, and hormones. Women's anatomy has often been blamed. For example, the Q angle. It's been assumed that women's hips are a little bit wider, so the Q angle is a little bit larger, and therefore there's a higher risk of ACL injury. But that's a myth that won't die, apparently, and there's no evidence at all for Q angle being associated with ACL injury risk. The stage a woman is at in her menstrual cycle has also been extensively studied and blamed. And one study went so far as suggesting that all teenage girls who are athletes should be put on the birth control pill to decrease their ACL injury risk. Again, there's no evidence for that, and I would suggest that there's some major ethical issues with that suggestion as well. So you can see this kind of anatomical, biological, physiological approach reflected in this table of currently identified risk factors for ACL injury. The vast majority of these risk factors that are identified in the literature are considered intrinsic, and I've noted those with the orange asterisks. They're considered internal to a person and therefore an individual's responsibility to fix. There's little consideration really in these tables of how influences from the environment and society might be influencing these risk factors. So with our gendered environmental approach, we're suggesting that perhaps risk factors that to this point seemed intrinsic to an athlete have an element of external influence that we could target for change, because that's the whole point, right? We want to identify risk factors that we can intervene with and make a difference and decrease injury rates. If we continue on with focusing on anatomy and hormones, things we really can't change and certainly not ethically, our ability to intervene and prevent injuries is limited. But if we look wider and look at environmental issues, we have a much better chance of being able to change things for the better. So we wanted to bring attention to gendered aspects of the environment in women's sports that could be affecting injury risk and injury experience. I'll start with just a few quotes that kind of brought me around to this point of view. These quotes are from a study that I did with some high school girls back in about 2018, 2019. I wanted to know the experience of high school girls using their high school weight room. I wanted to know the challenges, the barriers, the facilitators for them using that room and actually working out in it. And you can see by their quotes that they did not see that space as somewhere where they were safe or comfortable or welcomed. The boys physically took over the space, physically took over the equipment. They felt judged in that space on what they were doing, what they were wearing. They were also worried about getting too muscular, too bulky. That was masculine and not socially acceptable. And so much of the data that we got from that study was related to gendered aspects of the weight room. So that got me thinking more deeply about how that relates to injury risk. I'd already been thinking about some of those ideas, but this made me just think a little more deeply about it. So for example, I'm thinking about muscular strength and how that's protective against ACL injury. If girls and women don't feel welcome or supported in these weight room environments where they could get stronger, this implies there are gendered aspects to these environments that are contributing to their injury risk potentially. So our gendered environmental approach suggests that gender is pervasive. It's a pervasive environment that we can't get away from. We're in it all the time. We're exposed to it from the moment that we're born. We suggest that there are 4 different environments within sports where gender might influence injury risk. Pre-sport environment, so from the moment you're born until you actually enter some sort of sport environment. The training environment, the competition environment, and the treatment or the rehabilitation environment. So this is what our gendered environmental approach looks like. We based it on an existing sport injury model that basically took an athlete and that was exposed to risk factors, exposed to an inciting event. That athlete either suffered an injury or didn't. And then that injured athlete either went through the rehabilitation cycle and re-entered the sports cycle or left participation in sport entirely. So on top of that existing sports injury model, we superimposed our 4 gendered environments: pre-sport, training, competition, and treatment. And I'll go through each one of those and describe them briefly here. So in the pre-sport environment, you can think of the volume of gendered play that occurs and the different physical skill sets that develops and encourages. There's repeated societal messages from an early age as to the way girls and boys should move, or things that they should or shouldn't do, activities that they should or shouldn't participate in. Like the example here of throwing like a girl. So much of the focus of ACL injury prevention programs is how to move differently or more safely, involving more knee flexion, more trunk flexion, more use of your muscular strength versus your ligamentous strength. It seems plausible that those movement patterns that you develop at an early age in those gendered activities that you're expected to do could affect how you move later on during sport and could place girls and women at increased risk of injury. In the training environment, you can think of the gendered barriers to strength training, as I previously mentioned. So we know that increased strength is protective against sports injuries, and yet weight training is highly gendered activity. Girls and women don't feel supported and welcomed in those spaces. We can also think of the coaches that are often populating those spaces. They're most often men. If you'll remember back to that table, poor strength or low strength was seen as an intrinsic individual level risk factor for ACL injury. But if research is telling us that there are strong gendered environmental reasons that girls and women don't participate in weight training, how can we tell girls and women to get stronger, to decrease their ACL injury risk when the environment doesn't support it? Gendered influences within the competition environment starts with the basics of what are thought to be appropriate sports for girls and boys. So for example, when I was a kid, I would have loved to play ice hockey, but it wasn't available. Girls hockey wasn't available, and you couldn't play with the boys, so it just wasn't an option for me. You can also think of sports like tackle football, which are pretty much male-dominated sports. There are more women's teams now, but certainly the majority of people who participate in tackle football would be boys and men. So you just think about the different physical skill sets and the different injury risks that you're exposed to with these different types of activities and sports that you participate in. We can also see that there's gendered behavior in sport. So aggression and risk-taking behavior are typically viewed as masculine traits, but they're highly valued in sport environments. Girls and women have been shown to adopt masculine traits as a way to fit in better to sport. And so we know that there is an increased injury risk associated with aggression and risk-taking behaviors. And so that's an example of how this may set up girls and women for increased injury risk. In the treatment environment, there is evidence that women are less frequently offered ACL reconstructive surgery as a treatment option. So it makes you wonder, do healthcare professionals place different expectations or values on women's injuries versus men? There is research to show that that happens in other areas of healthcare, for instance, heart health. But we need to explore this more in sports medicine and see what's going on there. Women also take longer to return to sport after ACL injury than men. We rarely think of the impact of gendered roles and responsibilities that could impact the ability to participate adequately in rehabilitation. Repeated research shows that women do the majority of unpaid work at home, so things like caregiving, housework. Think of the time and energy it takes to do those things. So that could be a barrier to being able to have time and energy to properly rehabilitate, especially from a significant injury like an ACL rupture. So we want our gendered environmental approach to flip the script. Instead of assuming that girls and women are injury prone, we want people to reflect on how they are made injury prone. We recently completed a study called More Than Medals, where we interviewed retired Olympic women athletes from the UK and asked them about their injury experiences in sport. Their stories reflected this blaming of women's biology. They reported being dismissed, with their injury complaints just being kind of chalked up to their femaleness. And I quote, "You're just being hysterical. You're being hormonal. You're just being female. You're too dramatic." You'd get dismissed a lot easier than the male athletes would. And ultimately, the injury is why I've had to stop sport. Our gendered environmental approach encourages a move away from a focus on biology and hormones and physiology to consider environmental factors as well. And it is important to note here that we're not saying that we're moving completely away from considering biological and physiological and anatomical factors. Definitely there's a role there. But what we need to do is expand our view and see what we're missing, because we're obviously missing a piece of the puzzle. And we need to look at some environmental factors as well. A quote from a retired Olympic athlete shows the danger of this biological focus. "A lot of the time they would ask me, 'Is it your time of the month?' They decided that it might be something to do with the new fad, female reproductive stuff. It was almost like they were trying to find anything but looking at the structure of the joints." And that was an athlete who had experienced a major injury of one of their joints, and they were being told that it was caused by their hormonal profile. We believe that our gendered environmental approach can take us from marginal gains at the individual level to meaningful gains at the systems level. In support of this idea, through our research with the retired Olympic athletes, it was clear that an old boys club system was in place that affected injury risk and injury experience for all athletes. And I quote, "If an athlete suggested something, it was like you'd committed a sin, like you'd committed an offense, and you would then be basically shunned, almost like it was an affront to their power." Athletes basically felt voiceless and powerless, and showing that if we made change at a systems level, we could really make impact. I've put a QR code there that leads you to the More Than Medals website, and I encourage you to check it out. Share the link with anyone you think might be interested, coaches, athletes, parents. You can go there, and it's basically an online exhibition that tells the stories of these retired elite athletes through their direct words and through research poems that are voiced by actors, as well as a variety of illustrations that represents the athletes' stories. So I encourage you to check that out. And then there's a very short exit survey at the end that we'd love you to fill in too, that gives us an idea of your response to the online exhibition. So what does all this mean? How can we take action from what we've suggested in our paper? I always like to try to give some sort of practical application because we need to move research into practice and actually make a difference. The first thing for me here is that we need to understand that key changes need to be made across women's and men's sport. This is not a women's sport issue to be fixed just within women's sport. It's across all areas of sport. An easy thing we can do is make sure that we're not using unnecessarily gendered terms for exercises or exercise equipment. So for instance, there's no girls push-ups and boys push-ups. There's only push-ups from the knees, push-ups from the feet. There's no women's bars or men's bars. There's only bars of different weights and shapes. We can evaluate the physical spaces where our athletes train and compete. What kind of imagery, posters, pictures do we have up in weight training spaces, in gymnasiums, in locker rooms? What kind of messages are they sending implicitly or explicitly? And I just found this example last week in our own Bannatyne campus. So these images are promoting the use of our Joe Dope Center, which is great. But you'll notice the gendered aspect of them. The men are quite muscular, pushing some big heavy weights and weightlifting, and the women are participating in a aerobics class with very light weights. And so gendered images implicitly suggesting where people belong or where they don't. We can also focus on an athlete's goals, their performance gains, their physical and mental health, and not appearance. Appearance is often gendered in nature when we comment on it. For example, recognize an athlete's strength gains and not the change in their physique, like using words like toned or bulky. So staying away from those kinds of terms. We can also ensure that there are positive women role models around. This was one of the key findings that came out of our high school weight room study. The girls in that study reported that they would not have gone into the weight room at the high school if there was not an experienced, knowledgeable, friendly, welcoming woman kinesiologist who staffed that space and helped them along in their exercise journey. We need to also consider how gendered roles and responsibilities like childcare or work hours may interfere with an athlete's progress or their rehabilitation. We need to consider how their resources may be vastly different. So this is just an example of the difference in income between professional athletes in basketball, golf, and soccer. Often women professional athletes have to work a second job to make ends meet. And so if you think about the extra time and energy that goes into that and making money just enough to live on, that's time taken away from training, from rehabbing, from injuries, etc. We literally just need to start asking questions about people's lives outside sport when we're in a clinical encounter with them. What kinds of things might affect their training, their sport training, or their rehabilitation training that you're not thinking about when you're just thinking about biological tissue healing. And then remember that NCAA basketball weight room disaster that I described at the beginning. We really hope that whoever was involved in all those decisions reflected on how and why those decisions were made to provide vastly different equipment and space to women and men. There'll be many reasons, but at some point someone thought or believed that the women at the tournament wouldn't notice or care, that people outside the tournament wouldn't notice or care, and ultimately that the women's tournament didn't have as much value as the men's tournament. Some of these thoughts, beliefs, and decisions may have been implicit. They may not have purposely set out to harm or disadvantage women, but that was the ultimate result. So I think that's one of the most important messages that we want to get out with our gendered environmental approach, is just to ask people working in sports spaces to take a step back and reflect on the decisions they make and their behavior and why they do the things they do and why they make the decisions they do. And try to figure out whether there's any unintended consequences that may be disadvantaging girls and women and putting them at increased injury risk. And with that, I'll leave you with this positive image of a girl lifting weights. It was drawn by a girl that participated in one of my PhD studies quite a few years ago now. And that study involved resistance training to prevent ACL injury. And I just love the positivity radiating from it, and it gives me optimism for the future of women's sport. So thank you for listening. I'm happy to take questions or have a discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Parsons. I guess we are exclusively remote, so any questions, just raise your hand and speak. And beginning with Dr. Cooper.
Oh, thank you, Joanne. This is such an excellent presentation. Thank you. And I remember your early days and how perturbed you were by the lack of safe space in one high school in particular. And I'm wondering the political aspect of this, which would be dealing with the Winnipeg school division or other school divisions. And if you have if you've done overtures to them, and what are your thoughts on moving forward to try to get them to recognize the problem and do something about it?
A great question. Thanks, Archie. Yes, I continue to work with a couple of phys ed teachers that have been champions around this kind of issue for a long time. It's very difficult to get the word out, I find. We have not had a chance yet, but it's certainly on my radar for the upcoming year, is to present at the local professional development days for phys ed teachers. So they have annual, at least one day a year, where they hear different presentations. So that would be certainly a venue for that I've been looking at. The major stumbling block is budget. That's what we've come up against all the time, is with the particular circumstance in the school that I've been working with, is that they hired a woman kinesiologist to staff the weight room full time during school hours. And that has made all the difference in the school in changing the atmosphere around the weight room and around the varsity athletes and that. And but as you can imagine, hiring some professional full time takes money, and especially in the last 8 years before the current government, budgets were being cut and cut and cut, and so there was no room, according to other schools and leadership, for hiring someone into that kind of role. Not because they didn't see the value necessarily, but the immediate benefit wasn't tangible enough for them. The school that I've been working with values it enough that they've maintained that position through budget cuts and everything, which is fantastic. We just need to find those champions at other schools that we can try to make change from within at all the other schools would be wonderful.
Are there any other questions for Joanne? Well, not seeing any. Joanne, thank you very much for your excellent, timely, and thought-provoking presentation. And thank you to our audience for your participation.
Sorry,
Yeah.
just before I see Sandra's raised her hand, but I
For
also
sure.
want, get Sandra ask her question, but I'm interested to hear from people who are attending. If you have had any experiences in your own lives, in your own sport participation, that the ideas that I talked about today resonated, especially for you, I'd be really interested to hear from any of you on that. So I guess Sandra, you were up next.
Okay, great. Thanks for your presentation, Joanne. It's great, and we're finally getting caught up on all the things that you've been doing over the last couple of years, which is really nice. I'll just answer your question first off. I had a different experience in terms of junior hockey in Pinawa. I was the only girl who did play, and they welcomed me onto the team until I was 12 or 13, and then the agreement was that I would not play after that time. So that's how things went there. My question is just, I've just been reading the news articles recently about the fact that the women's NCAA games are getting more people watching them than NBA games and than any of the men's college games. And I'm just wondering, like, do you think that that will help the cause in any way, and or other things that the reasons behind that the interest in the women's games, if that might help the cause in any way?
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yes, I think in a way it will help the cause, because one of the arguments has always been, well, we can't pay the women as much because they don't bring in the money, right? They don't bring in the sponsorship, they don't bring in the media coverage, all that. And we're seeing that over the last year, that they can bring in that attention and the sponsorship and that. So I do think in that way, I think that will positively benefit this cause. On the flip side, though, what we're seeing in professional soccer in Europe, especially Europe and the UK, is that the very quick professionalization of soccer has resulted in the professionalization and popularity of soccer has resulted in schedules that are jam-packed. And so we have players playing for their professional team, but then they also play for their national team, and then so they're flying back and forth, and there's not enough rest time because the two team coaches and that don't talk to each other, and so there's not enough rest time built in. And so there's that aspect of it that I think is probably contributing to this rash of ACL injuries that we've seen in professional women's soccer. So I think I think we've benefited from this massive increase in interest in women's sport, but it's had a little bit of a negative effect. We need to catch up with the resources. We need to catch up with the resources that are available to the men's athletes in terms of professional medical staff. Lots of the women's teams still have volunteer physios and part-time medical staff, etc. They don't play on the same kind of pitches and fields as the men do. They're subpar. So those kinds of things haven't caught up yet to the popularity of the sport. So yeah, pros and cons.
Thanks, Joanne. I really enjoyed your chat, and it does make you kind of reflect as a female and athlete what my experiences were like. And I grew up as a competitive swimmer, and so we were in the weight room right next to the boys doing everything the same. And so I was like, oh yeah, it was fine. But now in hindsight, it's like the boys did the 1,500 meters, girls did 800 meters. So it was very much sort of like girls can't swim that far or whatever, but we all swam 6 kilometers every practice. Like there was no difference. So I didn't really feel it there. And I think where I struggled the most was in our junior high school. They divided gym class. The boys did weights and the girls had to do aerobics. I very much do not like aerobics. And I remember even asking, saying, can I do that? Like, I do that at swimming. I know that. And was told, no, it wasn't for girls. And it was so, I feel lucky that I had it within my sport, that I was able to feel confident in the high school gym. But yeah, I think it was very much, you wouldn't have seen girls in the high school weight room at my high school. For sure.
No, I agree. Yeah, thanks for sharing those. it's amazing really when you think about it. It's just so blatant. It's just so right there in your face, right? But it's just so taken for granted that that's the way things are, that no one really questions it. I did a survey a number of years ago now, I guess, here in Winnipeg of coaches of basketball, volleyball, soccer. And it was interesting. I asked questions about injury prevention and their beliefs around injury prevention and weight training. And even, I think this is about 6 years ago, even then coaches still thought that girls should start weight training later than boys. So boys should start, at 12 or 13 years of age or whatever, and girls should start at 15 or 16, which is it's funny. We know that that's the stereotype that, I don't know, it's going to damage girls or something, but it's actually the opposite way, because girls are more prone to ACL injuries when they're younger. 13, 14 is kind of when the peak is. So we need to be starting them even younger than boys probably, to get that injury prevention. So yeah, unfortunately, I think we've come a long way. I do think we've made strides, and I think there's a lot of improvements been made, but I still think there's a long way to go. Just when you think that, oh, it's getting better, and then another example of some sort of blatant sexism in sport comes out, and it's just amazing that it's still happening.
Well, one positive, perhaps, my son plays club soccer and he was on the U9 elite team, and they started them doing like indoor cross training and resistance and things. And the girls team have also been doing the same. So at least it's coming in some.
Yeah. Yeah. And I see Tessa's comment. Yes, I agree. You do see many more women enjoying the benefits of weight training now than you would have 10 years ago, for sure. It is getting somewhere. But then when you hear the study that I talked about with these retired elite Olympic athletes, and at the elite level, they're getting those comments about you're just being hysterical. It's just at the highest level of sport, these kinds of ideas are still pervasive, and it's preventing women from being diagnosed earlier, treated earlier, and ending some careers. So it's, yeah, it's quite shocking.
So can we do something about those pictures at the Joe Dope Center?
I actually know Adam quite well. I don't know if he's here today, probably not. Adam and I did our masters together, and he's now the manager of the Joe Dope Center. So I am going to have a conversation with Adam. Absolutely, I agree. And that's part of it, right? Is just calling it out when we see it and suggesting different ways that we could do things. Yeah, agreed.
Well, I don't want to jump the gun again, Joanne, but does anyone else have a question? Okay, I think we're really done this time. So thank you, Joanne. Excellent. And thank you, audience.
Thank you very much.